The little black girl told the biker she saw a stranger pull someone behind a reinforced door near the turbines. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. The night was thick with fog, and the sound of distant machinery hummed in the background as the little girl, barely 8 or 9 years old, ran toward the biker bar with her heart pounding in her chest. Her small feet barely touched the wet asphalt as she darted through the mist, her tear-streaked face set in desperation. She burst through the door, nearly tripping as she staggered toward the group of rough-looking bikers gathered around a table. They paused and looked up at her, sensing the urgency in her frantic eyes. "Please," she gasped, "you have to help me. I saw a stranger pull someone behind a reinforced door near the turbines." The bikers exchanged glances, trying to make sense of her words. The girl's voice shook as she continued. "He was big, wearing dark clothes, and he dragged them inside. I think they're in danger." Rick, the leader of the group, was the first to speak. His face was hard and weathered, his eyes sharp and calculating. He had seen his share of danger, but this was different. The girl's fear was palpable, and he knew something was wrong. "Where did you see this?" Rick asked, his voice steady but commanding. "Near the turbines, down by the old factory," she replied, pointing in the direction she had come from. "It's just past the old gate. Please, you have to help them." The bikers were silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. There was no time to waste. Rick stood up, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. "We're going," he said, his voice firm. The rest of the group nodded in agreement. The girl had come to them for help, and they wouldn't turn their backs on her. As the group of bikers made their way outside, the night air felt colder, heavier. The roar of their engines echoed through the empty streets as they sped toward the turbines, the wind whipping through their hair. The girl, still trembling, clung to Rick's side as they rode in silence. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into, but one thing was certain. She had seen something she shouldn't have, something that would change everything. The wind howled as they approached the factory, the turbines spinning slowly in the distance, their massive blades cutting through the air. The reinforced door she had spoken of was just ahead, half hidden in the shadows of the old building. Rick signaled for the bikers to slow down. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low but urgent. They stopped just out of sight of the door, the rumble of their engines dying down as they dismounted. The girl led the way, her small hands gripping Rick's sleeve as they approached the dark entrance. The smell of oil and rust filled the air, and the hairs on the back of Rick's neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. The door creaked open, just a crack, and they could hear muffled voices inside. Rick motioned for the others to stay back as he pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, standing in the dim light, was a man, his back to them, holding someone against the wall. The figure was hunched over, barely moving, as if they were unconscious. Rick's heart raced. He turned to the others, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to move, now." The air was thick with tension as Rick and the bikers silently moved closer to the reinforced door. The little girl, her face pale with fear, clung tightly to Rick's sleeve as they crouched behind a stack of old crates. Rick motioned for the others to stay low. The sound of muffled voices inside grew louder, and Rick's pulse quickened. Whoever was inside didn't know they were coming. The bikers were ready for anything, but the uncertainty of what they would find made the air feel heavier. As they stood still, waiting for the right moment, the girl spoke in a trembling whisper. Please help them. I saw him. He's hurting them." Rick nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "We're not leaving until we know what's going on in there," he said. Without a word, the bikers silently positioned themselves around the door, preparing for whatever might come next. Jack was the first to move. He gently pushed open the door just enough to peek inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The sight that greeted him made his heart drop into his stomach. There, standing against the wall, was a man holding another figure, their body limp in his arms. The person looked unconscious, their head hanging at an odd angle. The man's back was to them, and for a moment, Rick froze. He could hear the sound of breathing, labored, as if whoever was inside was struggling to stay awake. Rick's eyes narrowed. "This isn't good," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Jack, still watching through the crack in the door, looked back at Rick and gave a small nod. It was time. Without hesitation, Rick signaled to the others. "Move in. We go now." In perfect unison, the bikers surged forward, pushing the door wide open and charging into the room with their engines revving loudly. The man inside, startled by the sudden noise, spun around, his hands still gripping the unconscious person. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, his eyes narrowing. His tone was cold, and the look in his eyes made it clear he wasn't afraid of a group of bikers. But Rick wasn't intimidated. "We're here to make sure you don't hurt anyone else," Rick said, his voice low and steady. The man let out a mocking laugh, his grip tightening on the person in his arms. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered, his eyes flicking to the girl who had led them here. "You shouldn't have brought them here, little girl," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The girl flinched, but Rick stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his motorcycle. "Let them go," Rick demanded, his voice cold and unwavering. "We don't want to make this worse for you." The man's eyes flicked to the door, his mind calculating his escape. But before he could move, Diesel, the largest member of the group, stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "There's nowhere to go," Diesel said, his voice deep and rumbling. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking back to the unconscious figure in his arms. "You don't know what you're messing with," he growled. "I've got people, and they'll come for you." Rick didn't flinch. "We're not leaving until you let them go," he said. There was a tense silence as the two men stared each other down. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Finally, the man seemed to make up his mind. He grinned, but there was no warmth in his smile. "You're making a big mistake," he said, before shoving the unconscious figure away from him. "Take them," he spat, his eyes flashing with anger. Rick's heart raced as he rushed forward, his hands gently but firmly grabbing the limp figure. He could feel the person's body was cold and unresponsive, and his worry deepened. "Is she alive?" Jack asked, his voice tight with concern. Rick checked for a pulse and let out a sigh of relief when he felt a weak but steady beat. "She's alive, but barely," Rick said. "We need to get her out of here now." As Rick carefully lifted the unconscious woman into his arms, the bikers made their move. The man who had been holding her stood frozen, his eyes still filled with rage, but he didn't try to stop them. The tension in the room was palpable, but Rick knew they had won this round. "Let's get out of here," Rick said, his voice calm but urgent. The bikers quickly moved to the door, with Diesel and the others keeping watch. As they stepped back into the night, the sound of the bike's engines revving once again filled the air. The girl, still shaken but relieved, walked close behind them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rick looked down at her, his expression softening. "You did the right thing, kid," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. But as they rode off into the night, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whoever that man was, he wasn't done yet. And the bikers knew that they had just stepped into something far bigger than they had expected. The group of bikers rode in silence, the night air thick with tension. Rick could feel the weight of the unconscious woman in his arms, and the girl, still shaken, was close behind them. The streets were quiet, the hum of their engines the only sound cutting through the stillness. As they passed through the outskirts of town, Rick's mind raced. Who was that man, and why had he been holding her captive? And what did the turbines and the reinforced door have to do with all of this? He couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something much bigger than they had originally thought. The girl, who had been walking with her head down, finally spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. He wasn't alone," she said, her words sending a chill down Rick's spine. "There were others with him. They're watching." Rick's grip tightened on the woman, who was still unconscious in his arms. "What do you mean, watching?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. I saw them earlier," the girl said, her voice trembling. "They were hiding near the turbines, behind the tall metal fence. I think they were waiting for him to finish whatever he was doing." Rick's eyes narrowed as he processed her words. This was no random abduction. Whoever these people were, they were organized, and they had planned everything carefully. The woman in his arms could be the key to everything, but they needed to get her to safety first. "We'll figure it out," Rick said, trying to reassure her. But right now, we need to get her help. The group sped through the empty streets, making their way to the nearest hospital. It was a small, quiet place, not too far from the outskirts of town. Rick had been here a few times before, helping out some of the locals when they needed assistance. As they arrived, the bikers carefully unloaded the woman from Rick's arms and carried her into the emergency room. The staff quickly took over, hooking her up to an 4 and starting tests to determine the extent of her injuries. Rick stood at the edge of the room, watching with a sense of helplessness. He had saved her, but now what? The girl, who had been so brave back at the factory, was sitting in the waiting area, her eyes wide with fear. One of the bikers, Phantom, sat next to her, trying to comfort her. Rick walked over to them, his mind still spinning with questions. "Are you okay?" he asked the girl, kneeling down in front of her. She nodded but didn't speak. Rick knew better than to push her right now. She had already been through enough. He gave her a reassuring smile before turning to Phantom. "We need to find out more about this situation," Rick said, his voice low and determined. "What do we know so far?" Phantom pulled out his phone, scrolling through some notes. "Not much, just what the girl said," he replied. "The guy we encountered, he wasn't just some random thug. He had a name. His name's Lucas. And from what I can gather, he's been involved in some shady dealings for years. I've heard rumors about him working with some underground network, but nothing concrete." Rick's mind raced as he processed the information. Lucas. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Whatever was going on, it was much bigger than he had anticipated. And the fact that this Lucas guy had been working with a group made it even more dangerous. They needed to be careful, but Rick was determined. "Keep digging," he said to Phantom. "We need to know everything about this guy and his connections. If he's connected to something bigger, we need to be ready." The girl stood up, her small hands clutching her jacket tightly. "Will you find him?" she asked, her voice small but filled with hope. Rick looked at her, his heart heavy. "We will," he promised. "We'll make sure you're safe, and we'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." As the night wore on, the bikers continued their search for answers, following every lead, gathering whatever information they could. Rick couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something much darker than they had ever imagined. The hospital was quiet, but in the distance, the sound of engines could be heard, growing louder as the bikers prepared to head back into the shadows. They had no idea what they were walking into next, but one thing was clear: they weren't stopping until they had answers. And whoever Lucas was, they would bring him down, no matter the cost. The morning sun began to creep over the horizon as Rick and the rest of the bikers gathered around their bikes in the parking lot of the hospital. The night had been long and filled with unanswered questions. The woman they had saved was stable for now, but the situation had only gotten more complicated. Lucas and his crew were still out there, and Rick knew that time was running out. He couldn't afford to waste a moment. "We need to move, now," Rick said, his voice steady but urgent. The group nodded in agreement, their eyes focused and ready for what was to come. They had promised the girl that they would make sure she was safe, and they weren't backing down. The girl had fallen asleep in one of the waiting rooms, her small frame curled up on the couch, exhausted from the chaos of the night. Rick glanced over at her before turning back to the group. "We've got to find Lucas," he said, "and we need to find out what this whole operation is about." Phantom stepped forward, his face grim. "I've been doing some digging," he said, pulling out his phone. "Lucas is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a bigger organization behind him. They've been operating under the radar for years, but from what I've gathered, they're involved in human trafficking and some shady deals with corporations." Rick's jaw tightened. This was worse than he had imagined. Human trafficking? This wasn't just about one man anymore. This was about saving people, stopping a criminal network that had been hurting innocent lives for far too long. "How do we get to them?" Rick asked, his voice firm. "We need to find their base, figure out where they're hiding." Diesel, the giant of the group, spoke up, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "I've got a few contacts who might know where these guys are operating, but it's going to take time, and we're going to need backup." Rick nodded. "We don't have time," he said, "but we do have people who are loyal. Let's get to work." The bikers split up to gather information, reaching out to their networks, checking with anyone who might have information about Lucas and his crew. As Rick and the others made their calls, the weight of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about stopping one man. This was about stopping an entire organization that had been ruining lives for years. It wasn't going to be easy, but they weren't going to back down. As the day wore on, the bikers gathered at a local diner to regroup. The girl was still asleep, safe for now, but Rick knew that every minute counted. Phantom walked in, his phone in hand, his face serious. "I've got something," he said. "I traced one of Lucas's phone numbers. It leads to an old warehouse near the docks. It's been abandoned for years, but I'm betting that's where they're hiding." Rick stood up, his eyes narrowing. "Let's go." The bikers mounted their bikes and rode through the streets, the sound of their engines filling the air. The city was quiet, but Rick could feel the tension building. They were getting closer, and the stakes were getting higher. As they approached the warehouse, Rick's gut tightened. This wasn't going to be easy. They weren't just going up against Lucas anymore. They were going up against a well-organized group of criminals. But Rick was ready. They pulled into the parking lot of the warehouse, the engines of their bikes roaring as they came to a stop. The building loomed in front of them, dark and silent. Rick motioned for the group to stay quiet as they dismounted. He approached the entrance cautiously, his senses on high alert. "Stay close," Rick whispered. "We don't know what's inside." The group moved silently, their boots making no sound against the cracked pavement. As they approached the door, Rick noticed something strange. There were no guards, no signs of life. It was too quiet. "Something's not right," he muttered under his breath. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. There were crates and boxes piled high, but no sign of anyone. Rick's instincts told him something was off. He motioned for the group to spread out, each of them checking different corners of the warehouse. They moved cautiously, every step deliberate. But then, as Rick rounded a corner, he froze. There, standing in the shadows, was Lucas. Well, Lucas said with a grin, his voice cold and mocking. "I knew you'd come for me eventually." Rick's blood ran cold. This was it. The confrontation they had been waiting for. But it wasn't just Lucas standing there. Behind him, several other men stepped forward, all armed, all looking ready for a fight. Rick's hand hovered over his gun, but he didn't make a move. This wasn't just a fight, it was a battle for lives. And he wasn't going to back down now. "It's over, Lucas," Rick said, his voice calm but fierce. "You're done." Lucas's grin faded, and for a moment, there was a tense silence. Then, without warning, one of the men lunged at Rick. The fight had begun. The warehouse erupted in chaos as the first man lunged at Rick. His fist connected with Rick's shoulder, but Rick quickly countered, spinning out of the way and landing a solid punch to the man's stomach. The attacker grunted, stumbling back, but Rick wasn't slowing down. This was the moment. He could feel the weight of his promise to the girl and the lives that depended on him. The sound of fists meeting flesh and the grating of boots on concrete filled the air. Rick's focus sharpened as he watched the other bikers engage. Diesel was already grappling with one of the men, his massive frame making it impossible for the enemy to get a clean hit. Phantom, fast and precise, moved through the shadows, taking out another attacker before they even knew what hit them. "Stay sharp," Rick barked, his voice a command above the noise of the struggle. He needed to end this quickly. The group had come this far, and they couldn't afford to lose now. As Rick ducked under a swinging punch, he caught sight of Lucas. The man had stepped back, a sneer on his face, his hand resting on a gun holstered at his side. Lucas wasn't planning on fighting fair, but Rick was ready. He charged at him, moving faster than the man expected. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Rick growled. Lucas's eyes widened as Rick closed the distance. Just as Rick was about to tackle him, Lucas drew his gun, aiming it straight at Rick. "You're too late," Lucas hissed, his finger on the trigger. Time seemed to slow. Rick's instincts kicked in. He dove, knocking Lucas's arm aside just as the gun went off, the bullet grazing the side of Rick's jacket. Rick didn't hesitate. With a quick twist, he disarmed Lucas, sending the gun skidding across the floor. "You're not going anywhere," Rick said, his voice a low growl. Lucas's smirk faltered. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, backing away. But Rick wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "I know exactly who you are," Rick said, grabbing Lucas by the collar and slamming him against a nearby crate. "And I'm ending this tonight." Lucas struggled, trying to break free, but Rick's grip was unyielding. Behind them, the sound of the remaining bikers taking down the last of the men filled the air. Diesel and Phantom stood over their fallen opponents, making sure none of them would get up again. It's over, Rick said, his voice steady as he stared into Lucas's eyes. You're finished. Lucas's eyes flickered with a mix of rage and fear. You'll regret this, he growled. You have no idea who I work for. Rick's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The revelation that could change everything. Who are you working for? Rick demanded, not loosening his grip. Lucas hesitated, but then he smirked again, as if he were enjoying the tension. You'll find out soon enough, he said cryptically, his voice dripping with malice. Before Rick could react, there was a sudden sound from the far end of the warehouse. The unmistakable sound of a vehicle pulling up. The bikers froze, their heads snapping in the direction of the noise. Get ready, Rick muttered, tightening his grip on Lucas. The group moved into position, taking cover behind crates and steel beams. Diesel motioned for everyone to stay silent. The sound of the vehicle grew louder as it approached the entrance. The heavy thud of tires against the cracked concrete made the hairs on the back of Rick's neck stand up. Whoever was coming wasn't here for a friendly chat. The warehouse door creaked open, and two men stepped inside, both dressed in dark suits. They were too well dressed for this rough part of town, and their cold expressions made it clear they were no strangers to violence. The tension in the room thickened. Rick knew that the situation had just escalated. These men weren't just Lucas's associates. They were a new threat. The two men glanced around the warehouse, their eyes falling on Lucas, who was still held captive by Rick. The men didn't flinch at the sight of their leader in such a compromising position. You've got a lot of nerve, one of them said, his voice calm but with a threatening edge. Rick's eyes narrowed. I don't think I've met you, he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. The man who had spoken smiled coldly. We weren't expecting a group of bikers to get involved, he said, his gaze flicking over the others. But now that you're here, we'll just have to deal with you. Rick could feel the situation spiraling. These men had an aura of power around them, something that told him they were even more dangerous than Lucas. I don't care who you are, Rick said, stepping forward, his voice steady. You're not taking anyone else. The men exchanged a look, then one of them pulled out a small earpiece and spoke into it. We'll have to escalate this, he muttered under his breath. Rick's gut tightened. This wasn't over yet. And he wasn't about to let them walk away. As the men prepared for whatever was coming next, Rick could only wonder. Who were they really working for? And how far would this fight go? The two men stood still, their eyes locking onto Rick with an unsettling calm. The tension in the room thickened as the heavy door creaked closed behind them, sealing off any escape. The air felt heavier, as if every breath was a risk, each second pushing them further into a fight they couldn't avoid. Rick's hand tightened around Lucas's collar, and he shifted his weight, positioning himself between the two men and the rest of his crew. You've got some nerve walking in here like you own the place, Rick said, his voice cold and unwavering. You should have stayed out of this. The man who had spoken earlier, his face impassive, glanced briefly at the other biker standing by. Then he stepped forward, his boots clanging against the concrete floor. We don't need your approval, he said, his voice smooth but menacing. We didn't expect this to get so complicated, but it is what it is. We'll deal with you in due time. Rick's jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch. You're not taking anyone, he growled, keeping his eyes trained on the men. The air was thick with uncertainty. The two men had no fear, their bodies poised like they were ready for whatever came next. We're not here for a fight, but if you push us, you'll get one, the other man said, his voice cold, the words dripping with threat. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Rick kept his stance firm, and his mind raced. He couldn't let them take another step. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was much bigger, and he knew it. But Rick wasn't about to back down. You don't get to make the rules here, Rick said, his tone unwavering. We're taking Lucas, and we're taking down whoever's behind this operation. You're not stopping us. The two men exchanged a quick look, their eyes flicking between each other before locking onto Rick again. The silence in the room grew heavier, a standoff that felt like it could break at any moment. Without warning, one of the men reached into his jacket and pulled out a small radio. He spoke into it quickly, his words inaudible but urgent. Rick's senses went on high alert, and he motioned for his crew to stay on edge. Something wasn't right. We're not here for a negotiation, Rick said, taking a step forward. We're here to end this. The man with the radio gave Rick a hard stare, but there was no response. Instead, He turned his head slightly as if awaiting something. Rick's heart raced. This was a trap. Whatever was about to happen, they needed to be ready. Just as the tension reached its peak, the unmistakable sound of approaching motorcycles echoed through the building. Rick's head snapped toward the door, his instincts screaming. More of them were coming. Stay sharp, Rick warned his crew, his voice low. We need to move fast. But it was already too late. The sound of engines grew louder, closer, as if a convoy was heading straight for them. Rick's eyes darted to Lucas, who was still struggling weakly in his grasp. The man was starting to lose his fight, his breath shallow, and Rick could see the fear in his eyes. He needed to act. Now. This is your last chance, Rick said, his voice filled with warning. Call off whoever's coming, and maybe we'll make it out of here without a full-scale war. The two men didn't flinch. Instead, the one with the radio spoke again, this time into the microphone, his words sharp and direct. No more games, he said coldly. Let's finish this. The rumble of engines outside reached a fever pitch, and Rick knew the situation was slipping out of control. The room was about to erupt into chaos, and if they didn't act quickly, they might not make it out alive. Without warning, Diesel lunged forward, his massive frame barreling into one of the men. The biker's strength sent the man crashing into a stack of crates, and chaos erupted. Rick's crew surged forward, taking down the remaining attackers with swift precision. The fight was on, and the stakes had never been higher. Rick felt the adrenaline surge through him as the men continued to move in. He threw a hard punch, knocking one of the men to the ground, but as he looked around, he saw the silhouettes of several more men emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden beneath dark masks. This wasn't just a group of thugs. This was a full-scale operation, and Rick knew that their battle was far from over. The door slammed open, and more men flooded in, their heavy boots echoing in the vast space. Rick's pulse raced, and he realized they had underestimated the scale of this fight. It wasn't just about Lucas anymore. They were facing a well-organized force, and if they didn't get out now, they might all end up trapped. Get Lucas out of here, Rick yelled, shoving his way through the chaos to reach the exit. Move now. As his crew scrambled to follow orders, Rick's mind raced. They needed a plan. Fast. But with more enemies coming in every second, the only thing that mattered now was survival. He couldn't let them down. Not now. Not when they were so close. The warehouse had erupted into full chaos. The bikers were now fighting not only Lucas's crew, but a full force of masked operatives that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Rick's heart raced as he fought off another assailant, landing a solid punch to his opponent's jaw. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His crew, the girl they had promised to protect, and the unknown enemy they were now facing. Diesel and Phantom were already taking down men left and right, but it wasn't enough. They were vastly outnumbered, and more were pouring in every second. Rick could hear the engines of their motorcycles still running outside, the hum of the revving engines almost drowned by the sounds of gunshots and the clash of bodies. There was no way they would make it out with everyone in one piece unless they acted fast. The woman, still unconscious, was being guarded by one of the bikers near the exit, but Rick knew the enemy wasn't going to let them leave easily. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his mind was working furiously to come up with a plan. We need to split up, Rick shouted over the noise, his voice sharp and commanding. Take out the men closest to the exit and create a clear path. We're not staying here to die. Diesel nodded and moved toward the far end of the warehouse, knocking down a few more attackers with his raw strength. Phantom, agile and quick, darted to the left, taking out another enemy before they could react. But as Rick turned back toward the entrance, his eyes caught something that made his blood run cold. A figure standing in the shadows, their eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. We've got company, Rick muttered. The figure stepped forward, revealing themselves to be someone Rick hadn't seen before. Tall, with a cold, calculating look in their eyes, the newcomer wore a tactical vest and carried an assault rifle. This wasn't just a low-level thug. This was someone with power. Well, what do we have here? The figure said, their voice calm, almost amused. A group of bikers trying to play hero? Rick didn't flinch. Who are you? He demanded. You're too late to stop us. The figure smiled, but it wasn't friendly. I'm here to make sure things end your way, they said, their voice dripping with sarcasm. But you're not walking out of here without consequences. Rick's mind raced. Whoever this person was, they were the real deal. But Rick wasn't going to back down. You're making a mistake, he said, stepping forward, his fists clenched. The figure tilted their head, as if considering Rick's words. Then, without warning, they lifted the assault rifle, pointing it directly at Rick. Time seemed to slow. Rick's heart skipped a beat, but he wasn't going to let this person intimidate him. He had to move. In the split second before the figure could pull the trigger, Rick lunged, knocking the rifle aside and throwing a punch that sent the figure staggering back. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse, but it missed. Rick didn't waste any time. He kept his momentum, spinning around and landing a quick blow to the figure's gut, knocking them to the ground. "Get up," Rick shouted, as the bikers continued to fight their way through the chaos. But the figure wasn't finished. They quickly recovered, grabbing a knife from their belt and charging toward Rick. The fight wasn't over, and Rick had to stay on his toes. He dodged the knife, grabbing the figure's wrist and twisting it, forcing them to drop the weapon. "You're not in charge here," Rick snarled, his voice full of rage. Just then, the sound of more motorcycles revving up outside reached Rick's ears. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. The real battle was coming, and they had to get out before reinforcements arrived. "Move," Rick yelled to his crew. "We've got to get out now." The bikers, adrenaline still pumping through their veins, pushed forward with renewed determination. Rick kept his eyes on the figure, who was slowly getting back up. But he didn't give them a second chance. With one last shove, Rick pushed the figure to the ground and motioned for the others to retreat. They had to get out of the warehouse before the cavalry arrived. As they ran toward the exit, Rick could hear the sound of their engines roaring to life outside. The night was still dark, and the adrenaline still buzzed in his body, but they weren't safe yet. They needed to move quickly. The bikers sped down the narrow alleyway, the sound of tires screeching as they took off into the night. But Rick knew this wasn't the end. They had just scratched the surface of something much bigger. The fight wasn't over, and whoever was behind this operation wasn't going to give up that easily. Rick looked over at the girl, who was still safe for now, but the fear in her eyes told him that this nightmare wasn't over. They had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. The engines roared as the bikers sped through the streets, their tires skimming over the wet pavement in the cool night air. Rick's heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins as they tore away from the warehouse. The fight had been brutal, and they had barely escaped with their lives, but the real danger was just beginning. The enemy was still out there, and they had to find out who was really pulling the strings. The group didn't slow down until they were miles away from the warehouse, finally pulling into a secluded lot behind an old diner. The sound of their bikes fading away, they dismounted, their faces grim. Rick looked over at the girl, who was still holding onto one of the bikers for support. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she hadn't said a word since they left the warehouse. He could see the toll the night had taken on her. She was just a kid, and she had been thrown into something she didn't understand. "Are you okay?" Rick asked, his voice softening as he approached her. The girl nodded but didn't speak. Rick could tell she was shaken, and he didn't blame her. "You're safe now," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't out of danger yet. "We need answers," Rick said, turning to the others. "Lucas is just a pawn, and whoever is behind this isn't going to stop until they finish what they started." Diesel, still catching his breath, nodded in agreement. "We've barely scratched the surface," he said, wiping sweat off his brow. "There's a bigger operation behind all this. They won't just let us walk away." Rick's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had just entered the lion's den. Whoever was running the show had resources, and they wouldn't hesitate to use them. Rick's hand clenched into a fist as he thought about the girl, and the people like her who were being dragged into this mess. He had made a promise to her, and he wasn't about to break it. "We need to find out everything we can about this operation," Rick said, determination in his voice. "We'll take the fight to them." Phantom stepped forward, his face set. "I've got some contacts," he said, pulling out his phone. "But we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to track them down." Rick nodded. "We don't have time to waste. Let's get started." As Phantom made a few calls, Rick walked over to the girl, who was now sitting on the back of one of the bikes, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. He sat down beside her, trying to find the right words. "You did good back there," Rick said softly. You stayed calm, and you brought us to the right place. You're stronger than you think. The girl looked up at him, her eyes still filled with fear, but also something else, hope. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him told him she understood. We're going to make sure you're safe, Rick promised, his voice firm. No one's going to hurt you again. Meanwhile, Phantom finished his call and approached Rick, his expression more serious than ever. I've got a lead, he said. There's a man, an informant, who's been tracking these guys for a while. He's been trying to bring them down, but he's too scared to go public. He'll talk to us, but we have to be careful. He's afraid for his life. Rick's mind was already moving, calculating the risks. Where is he? He asked. We'll meet him at a safe spot, Phantom replied. He's agreed to give us everything he knows, but we need to act fast. He's been on the run, and these guys are getting closer to finding him. Rick nodded. Let's move out. We don't have much time. The bikers got back on their bikes, the sound of their engines filling the night air as they made their way to the meet-up location. Rick's eyes scanned the surroundings as they rode through the streets, his mind focused on what they would learn from the informant. This was the break they needed. If they could get the information from this man, they would be one step closer to taking down whoever was behind this. The streetlights flashed as they sped through the city, the bikes cutting through the darkness like a blade. As they reached the meeting point, a small, dimly lit alleyway, Rick could feel the weight of the moment. This could change everything. They dismounted quickly, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The informant was already waiting, a scruffy man in his mid-40s, his eyes darting nervously as he glanced over his shoulder. You're Rick, right? He asked, his voice low and shaky. I don't have much time. They're close. Rick nodded, his gaze sharp. Tell us everything you know, he said. We're here to help, but you need to trust us. The informant swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between the bikers. All right, he said, his voice trembling. I'll tell you what I know, but you have to promise me that you'll get me out of here when this is over. I can't go back. They'll kill me. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him reassurance. You have our word, he said. Just tell us what we need to know. The informant nodded. And as the night stretched on, he began to speak, revealing the truth about the shadowy organization behind the chaos they had all been thrown into. The informant's voice was shaky as he began to reveal the information they had been desperately searching for. Rick stood, listening intently, his mind racing with the weight of the situation. The others gathered around, their eyes focused on the man as he spoke in hushed tones, looking over his shoulder every few seconds to make sure they weren't being watched. All right, the informant started, his hands trembling. I've been keeping tabs on this group for months. They're not just small-time criminals. They've got ties to big corporations, high-level government officials, and even some underground organizations. Rick's brows furrowed as the words sank in. This wasn't just a local operation. They were dealing with a network that stretched far beyond what any of them had anticipated. How big are we talking here? Rick asked, his voice steady, though the implications of the informant's words sent a chill down his spine. The man wiped his brow nervously, his eyes darting to the shadows. I don't have all the details, he said. But what I do know is that they've been trafficking people for years, smuggling them in and out of the country. They've got connections everywhere, law enforcement, the military, you name it. They've been covering their tracks for a long time, and anyone who tries to expose them, well, they don't last long. Rick felt a deep sense of anger, his fists clenching as the truth hit him. So, this is bigger than just one kidnapping, he muttered, more to himself than to the informant. This goes all the way to the top. The informant nodded, his face pale. Yes, and they've got resources. Weapons, money, safe houses. They've been using old warehouses like the one you found to store their goods, to keep people hidden. And they're not just moving people. They're using them for all kinds of illegal activities, from forced labor to worse. Diesel, who had been standing off to the side, clenched his jaw. We need to shut this down, Rick, he said, his voice low and filled with determination. Rick nodded. We will, Diesel. But first, we need to figure out who's in charge. This is just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The informant took a deep breath, looking at Rick with a mixture of fear and resolve. I don't know all the names, he said. But there's one person you need to look out for. A man named Eli Graves. He's the one pulling all the strings. He's been hiding in plain sight, using his position in a major tech corporation to cover his tracks. If you can get to him, you'll take down the whole operation. Rick's mind was already racing. Eli Graves. The name echoed in his head, and he knew they couldn't waste any time. Do you know where we can find him? Rick asked urgently. The informant hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I've got a lead. There's a meeting scheduled for tomorrow night at an old office building downtown. It's supposed to be a high-level deal. If you want to find Graves, that's where he'll be. Rick turned to his crew, his eyes hardening. We're going to that meeting, he said, his voice filled with purpose. We get in, we get the intel, and we bring down Eli Graves. Phantom stepped forward, his face serious. What about the girl? He asked, his gaze flickering toward the young girl who had been silently listening to the conversation. Rick looked over at her, his heart softening. She had been through so much already. She's staying with us, Rick said. We'll make sure she's safe. But we can't do this alone. We need to hit Graves where it hurts, and that means we need to move fast. The group nodded in agreement. Their expressions hardened with resolve. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. As Rick and the crew prepared for the next phase of their mission, they knew the stakes had never been higher. The shadows of corruption and violence loomed larger than ever, and if they were going to put an end to this nightmare, they had to strike first. The girl, still sitting quietly by the bikes, looked up at Rick, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. He gave her a reassuring smile, though inside he was already bracing for the battle ahead. The fight to stop Eli Graves and his operation was only just beginning, and Rick knew it wouldn't be easy. But with his crew by his side and the truth finally out in the open, he wasn't about to let anyone stand in their way. The following evening, Rick and his crew found themselves parked a few blocks from the old office building in downtown. The building was an imposing structure, its glass windows reflecting the fading light of the setting sun. From the outside, it seemed abandoned, but Rick knew better. He could feel the weight of the mission settling in. This was their chance to take down Eli Graves and expose the network that had been terrorizing so many innocent lives. Rick looked at his crew, their faces set with determination. Diesel stood at the front of the group, his massive frame hard to miss, while Phantom adjusted his gear, checking every pocket and knife with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. We go in quiet, Rick said, his voice steady but full of purpose. We get the intel, and we get out. No mistakes. The group nodded in agreement, their expressions serious. They had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to execute. The girl, who had been staying with them in hiding, was resting safely at a location away from the action. Rick had promised her safety, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. He glanced at her empty spot in the rearview mirror, feeling the weight of his promise pushing him forward. They moved swiftly through the shadows, keeping close to the walls as they approached the building. The door was unguarded, just as the informant had said it would be. But Rick knew they couldn't be too careful. The building might look abandoned, but the people they were dealing with had eyes everywhere. As they entered the lobby, the silence was deafening. The place smelled of dust and old paper, but there was an unsettling tension in the air, as if something darker was lurking just beneath the surface. Rick motioned for the group to spread out, checking the hallways and doors as they moved deeper into the building. They were in unfamiliar territory, and any misstep could be fatal. As they reached the elevator, Phantom checked the panel. It was clear they needed to take the stairs. The building had been designed for secrecy, and the elevator would likely be a trap. We take the stairs, Rick whispered, his voice low. Stay quiet and stay alert. The group moved with the efficiency of a well-trained unit, their footsteps barely audible as they ascended the staircase. The building's layout was labyrinthine, and every corner could be hiding danger. But Rick's focus never wavered. This was their best shot, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As they reached the top floor, they paused. Rick held up his hand, signaling for the group to stop. He listened carefully. In the distance, he could hear voices. The low murmur of a conversation, but not in the open. They were close. Rick motioned for Diesel and Phantom to take point, while he brought up the rear. They moved down the hallway, the sound of their boots muffled by the old carpet. As they rounded the corner, Rick's heart skipped a beat. There, in the dim light, was Eli Graves. He was standing in front of a large conference table, his back turned, speaking to a group of men dressed in dark suits. They looked like businessmen, but the cold, Calculating expressions on their faces told Rick everything he needed to know. These were not ordinary men. These were players in a much bigger game. Rick's muscles tensed. This was the moment they had been waiting for. He had to act quickly, but carefully. Any wrong move, and this entire operation could come crashing down. He motioned for the others to stay low as they crept closer. They had to hear what was being said. "I don't care how much it costs." Eli's voice echoed through the hallway. "We need to move those people out fast. If we keep them in the area too long, the authorities are going to catch on. I want everything cleared out by tomorrow night. No exceptions." Rick's grip tightened on his gun. This was it. They were talking about the trafficking ring. The people they had been trying to save. Rick's heart raced. He needed to get closer. "What's the status on the shipment?" Another man asked, his voice gruff. "Are we ready?" Eli paused for a moment, his voice low and dangerous. "Everything's ready," he said. "The last batch is on its way. We've got the buyers lined up. This will be our biggest deal yet." Rick's anger flared. The monsters in front of him had no idea what was coming. They were about to face a reckoning. Rick motioned for Diesel and Phantom to stay behind him as they moved into position. There was no turning back now. He was ready. With a swift motion, Rick stepped forward, his voice cold as he shouted, "Eli Graves." The room fell silent. The men turned toward him, their expressions shifting from surprise to recognition. Eli's eyes locked with Rick's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Eli smiled. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Rick's blood boiled. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice firm. "You're not getting away with this anymore." Eli's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "We'll see about that," he said, before signaling for his men to move. The fight was about to begin, and Rick knew it wouldn't be easy. But he had no intention of letting Eli Graves and his operation walk away. Not this time. The room exploded into chaos as Eli Graves' men moved with swift precision, drawing weapons from under their coats and aiming them at Rick and his crew. It was clear that Eli had been expecting trouble, and now the confrontation was unavoidable. Rick didn't flinch. The weight of the situation was heavy, but he was ready. He had no intention of walking away now. "Take cover," Rick shouted as he dove behind a nearby pillar, the sound of gunshots echoing through the room. The bikers immediately scattered, ducking behind whatever cover they could find. Phantom, ever the quick thinker, was already pulling out his sidearm, returning fire with practiced accuracy. Diesel, always the heavy hitter, took a moment to size up the situation, then rushed forward, using the chaos to his advantage. Rick could feel the adrenaline surging as he peered around the pillar, trying to get a clear shot at Eli. He could see the man standing in the back of the room, flanked by several of his men, watching the chaos unfold with cold detachment. "This is what happens when you interfere," Eli's voice rang out, his tone mocking. "You think you can just waltz in here and stop what we've built? You've no idea what you're dealing with." Rick's eyes narrowed. He had heard enough. He wasn't going to let Eli get away this time. "You'll be the one who doesn't know what's coming," Rick growled under his breath. He turned to his crew, motioning for them to move. "We need to take them down. Fast." The bikers surged forward, moving like a well-oiled machine. Phantom fired from his position, covering Diesel as he charged toward one of the men, knocking him down with a single blow. Rick followed closely behind, his eyes locked on Eli. The gunfire was deafening, but Rick didn't lose focus. He knew the only way to end this was to take down their leader. Eli must have known it too, because the moment Rick moved closer, Eli raised his hand, signaling his men to pull back. "This is your last chance, Rick," Eli called out, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Walk away while you still can. This fight isn't yours to win." Rick's blood boiled at the sound of Eli's voice. He was trying to manipulate the situation, to make them hesitate. But Rick wasn't going to give in to fear. "You've hurt too many people, Eli," Rick shouted, stepping into the open, his gun aimed directly at him. "This ends now." The tension in the air was palpable as Eli's smile faltered. He didn't speak for a moment, and for a brief instant, it seemed like the two of them were locked in a battle of wills. But then Eli raised his own weapon, and the standoff turned into a full-blown shootout. Rick ducked behind a column just as Eli fired, the bullet grazing the side of his jacket. He didn't waste a second. He sprang forward, moving quickly, closing the distance between them. With one fluid motion, Rick ducked low, avoiding another shot from Eli's gun, and lunged at him. The two men collided, and Rick managed to knock the gun out of Eli's hand. They hit the floor, struggling for control, fists flying. Rick's rage was unstoppable as he landed blow after blow. But Eli was tough, and he fought back with everything he had, trying to regain the upper hand. "You're nothing," Eli spat as he struggled to throw Rick off him. "You're just a damn biker. You'll never win." But Rick's response was simple. He grabbed Eli's collar and pulled him in close. "I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again," Rick said through gritted teeth. He lifted Eli off the floor, throwing him into one of the nearby tables. Eli groaned in pain, but he wasn't finished yet. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild with fury. He reached for something on the table, something that looked like a detonator. Rick's eyes widened as he realized what Eli was planning. "No!" Rick shouted, rushing forward. But it was too late. Eli pressed the button, and the room shook with a deafening blast. The walls rattled, the windows shattered, and the floor beneath them trembled. The explosion threw Rick and the others off their feet, sending them crashing to the ground. For a moment, everything went silent. Rick's ears rang from the blast, but he pushed through the disorientation, trying to regain his bearings. As the dust settled, Rick could barely make out the sounds of heavy breathing and coughing around him. His crew was still alive, but they had taken a hard hit. Rick shook off the pain, forcing himself to his feet. The warehouse was in ruins. Debris littered the floor, and the fire from the explosion was starting to spread. But amidst the chaos, Rick's eyes caught sight of something. Eli was gone. He had escaped in the confusion. "Damn it," Rick muttered under his breath. He didn't have time to waste. They had to find him before he disappeared again. "We move now," Rick ordered, rallying his crew. "We finished this." They had come this far. They weren't going to stop until Eli Graves and his operation were brought to justice. The fight wasn't over yet, but Rick wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The warehouse was a wreck, its once pristine walls now scarred by the explosion, with debris scattered across the floor like a battlefield. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the fire from the blast was quickly spreading, crackling as it consumed whatever it could. Rick could feel the heat on his skin, but his focus was sharp. He had to find Eli. He couldn't afford to let him slip away again. The bikers were on their feet, but the blast had knocked the wind out of them. Diesel was rubbing his neck, Phantom was checking his sidearm, and even though they were shaken, the crew was still ready to move. "We've got to move fast," Rick said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Eli's gone, but he's not getting away. Not this time." He scanned the room, looking for any signs of where Eli might have gone. The explosion had left a trail of destruction, and, while the fire was a threat, it also provided them with cover. Rick knew Eli would use the chaos to disappear, but he wasn't going to let that happen. He turned to his crew. "We'll split up. Phantom, take the back exit. Diesel, cover the side door. I'll take the front. We find Eli, we bring him down." The bikers didn't hesitate, immediately moving to their assigned positions. Rick's heart was still racing, but his mind was laser-focused on their target. He walked cautiously toward the front of the building, keeping his eyes peeled for any movement. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the smoke, and Rick's senses went on high alert. He could hear something, a faint rustle, but it was drowned out by the roar of the fire behind him. He stopped, listened, and then, there it was again. Footsteps. Rick's instincts told him he wasn't alone. He drew his gun, keeping it low as he approached the source of the sound. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Rick's senses were heightened, his focus sharpened to a razor's edge. He turned the corner and froze. Eli was standing there, his back to Rick, near the back exit. He hadn't seen Rick yet, but the moment of opportunity was fleeting. Rick didn't waste it. He moved fast, rushing forward, but just as he got close, Eli whipped around, his eyes wide with realization. "You're too late," Eli sneered, his voice filled with venom. In his hand, he held a detonator. "You can't stop this now." Rick's blood ran cold as he realized what Eli was about to do. "No," Rick shouted, rushing forward, but Eli was already pressing the button. There was a moment of silence, a heartbeat of stillness before the ground shook beneath them, and the building rocked as another explosion rang out, even bigger than the first. The force of the blast threw Rick back, slamming him into the floor. Pain shot through his body, but he fought through it, struggling to rise. He could hear the screams of his crew, the crackling of fire, but his vision blurred as he struggled to get to his feet. The fire was getting worse, and the whole structure was unstable now. "Get up, Rick! Get up!" Diesel's voice rang out, and Rick pushed himself up, gritting his teeth against the pain. The room was now engulfed in flames, and the heat was unbearable. He had to move fast. The explosion had knocked out the lights, and the only illumination came from the fire itself, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Rick stumbled to his feet and saw Phantom running toward him, dragging one of the bikers with him. "We need to get out," Phantom shouted, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. Rick nodded, but his mind was still on Eli. Where had he gone? "We're not leaving without him," Rick growled, his eyes scanning the smoke-filled room. The fire was spreading faster now, and Rick knew they had little time. Phantom hesitated, but Rick's determination was clear. "He's not getting away," Rick said. "We'll get him." They made their way through the smoke, moving toward the back exit. The heat was unbearable, but they pushed through, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the roar of the flames behind them. As they neared the door, a shape appeared in the shadows. Rick's heart skipped a beat. It was Eli. He was standing near the exit, his eyes cold and calculating as he watched Rick approach. "You think you can stop me?" Eli sneered, raising his hand, but Rick didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, grabbing Eli by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "This ends now," Rick said, his voice low and dangerous. Eli's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and anger, but Rick didn't care. The fight was over. Eli wasn't going to hurt anyone else. Rick raised his fist, ready to bring it down, but just as he did, he heard a noise from behind them. A shout, a cry. The door burst open, and more of Eli's men flooded into the room, guns raised. Rick froze for a split second, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He turned to his crew, his voice firm. "Get him out of here," Rick shouted. "I'll hold them off." Diesel and Phantom didn't hesitate. They rushed forward, taking down the men as Rick stood between them and Eli. The fight wasn't over yet, but they were closer than ever to ending it. Rick wasn't going to let anyone, especially not Eli, get away. This was their moment. He could feel the weight of the battle on his shoulders, but he was ready. This was it. The final showdown. The sound of gunfire echoed in the ruined warehouse as Rick's crew fought their way through the last of Eli Graves' men. The air was thick with smoke, and the fire that had consumed parts of the building was rapidly spreading. But Rick wasn't focused on the flames. His eyes were locked on Eli, who had managed to slip through their grasp once again. The final showdown was at hand. Rick moved with precision, dodging gunfire, taking down one of Eli's remaining guards with a swift punch. His mind raced, calculating the risks as his crew pushed forward. Diesel and Phantom were already clearing the path to the exit, but Eli was still in the room, slipping away in the chaos. Rick's determination burned like fire as he moved toward him, his every step fueled by the need to stop this once and for all. "You're not getting away," Rick muttered to himself, his hand tightening around his gun. As he rounded a corner, there he was. Eli stood near a broken window, his back turned, looking out over the wreckage of his empire. "You're too late," Eli said, his voice dripping with smugness. "It's over. You've already lost." Rick's heart pounded as he approached, gun drawn. "You're wrong," Rick replied coldly, his voice firm. "It's over for you." Eli turned, his expression twisted with frustration. "You don't get it, do you? You can't stop this," he sneered, pulling out a small device from his jacket pocket. "This network is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. And once I'm gone, there will be someone else to take my place." Rick's eyes locked onto the device in Eli's hand. A detonator, a final attempt to destroy everything. But Rick was faster. In one smooth motion, he reached out and knocked the device from Eli's hand, sending it skidding across the floor. Eli lunged at him, fists flying, but Rick was ready. He dodged the first punch and countered with a strike to Eli's gut. The man staggered back, gasping for air, but Rick didn't give him a chance to recover. With a hard shove, Rick sent Eli crashing into a nearby steel beam, the force of the impact knocking the breath out of him. Eli groaned, trying to push himself up, but Rick wasn't finished. "You're done," Rick said, his voice low and final. With a swift movement, he grabbed Eli by the collar and slammed him against the beam. "You've hurt enough people. This ends tonight." Eli's eyes were wild with anger and fear. He tried to squirm free, but Rick's grip was unyielding. You think you've won? You think you can just walk away from this? Eli spat, blood trickling from his lip. There's always someone else ready to take my place. You'll never get rid of this. Rick didn't flinch. Maybe you're right, he said coldly. But I'm going to make sure you don't hurt anyone again. With that, Rick shoved Eli to the ground, turning his back for a moment to check on his crew. Diesel and Phantom were rounding up the last of Eli's men, making sure they weren't going anywhere. The fire was creeping closer, but they were still standing. Rick turned back to Eli, whose face was contorted in rage and disbelief. You think you've won, Eli hissed, but this is just the beginning. Rick narrowed his eyes. It's over, he repeated. You're going to jail, and you're going to rot there. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder as the police finally arrived. The cavalry was here. Rick's mission was complete. He watched as officers entered the building, taking Eli into custody. The man was still spitting insults, but Rick couldn't care less. He had kept his promise. The girl was safe, and Eli Graves' reign of terror was coming to an end. As the fire trucks arrived and the flames were contained, Rick stood outside the building, looking at the damage. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had taken down the heart of the operation. Eli was out of the picture, and that meant the people who had been hurt, people like the girl, could finally have a chance at healing. Diesel clapped him on the back. Good work, Rick, he said, his voice filled with approval. Rick nodded, his gaze focused on the horizon. It's not over, he replied quietly. But it's a start. The girl had been through so much, but she was safe now. And as for Rick and his crew, they were ready for whatever came next. They had won this battle, but the war against the darkness Eli had unleashed wasn't finished. But Rick wasn't afraid. With his crew by his side, they were ready for whatever came next. And this time, they were prepared to take it all the way to the end. In this thrilling chapter of the Hell Angels stories, we follow Rick and his crew as they navigate through danger and face off against a powerful criminal organization led by the ruthless Eli Graves. With high stakes, intense action, and moments of sheer determination, Rick's journey to stop Eli and his criminal network unfolds in an explosive series of events. The Hell Angels stories showcase the relentless pursuit of justice by Rick and his team as they battle through gunfights, explosions, and a web of corruption to bring down one of the most dangerous individuals they've encountered. As the group of bikers works together to outsmart and capture their enemies, they find themselves in the heart of a deadly game, where the stakes are higher than ever. The climax of this Hell Angels stories chapter sees Rick facing Eli Graves in a final showdown, where survival is uncertain and the outcome will determine the fate of many. With the backdrop of destruction and the looming threat of further violence, the Hell Angels stories bring a sense of urgency and suspense, keeping readers on the edge of their seats. The conclusion to this chapter marks the beginning of a new chapter in Rick's mission, and as he vows to continue his fight, the legacy of these Hell Angels stories will live on, driving them toward their next challenge.